A mountain man's family gave him a worthless mine, unaware it was full of gold deposits. He rides west, cast out by his kin, carrying nothing but a deed they thought was a joke. But when he reaches the lonely ridge, smoke curls from a cabin chimney, and inside waits a widow and 2 orphaned children with nowhere else to go. As the church bell tolls and whispers spread through town, the truth breaks loose that worthless mine sits on a fortune men will kill to claim. The law turns crooked, the sheriff's keys rattle, and strangers with railroad money circle like wolves. Now, this outcast must choose walk away and lose the only family he's ever known, or fight for gold that could either destroy them all or save everything they love. Dust rises, rifles glint in the sun, and a preacher's voice carries through. The jailhouse bars. What is a man's true worth? When the final gun echoes off the mountains, will gold tear them apart or bind them together forever? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Autumn wind whistled through the bare trees as Caleb Boone stood at the edge of the cemetery. The last rays of sunlight caught the fresh-turned earth of his father's grave, but brought no warmth to his heart. His massive frame, hardened by years in the wilderness, drew stares from the townsfolk who hurried past. His siblings, huddled together near the grave, their fine clothes marking them as proper townfolk. None met his eyes. His sister Martha pulled her shawl tighter, turning away when he glanced her way. His brother James whispered something that made the others titter behind their hands. Caleb's scarred fingers tightened on his worn hat. He'd cleaned up best he could for the funeral, but his patched coat and scuffed boots marked him as different, a stranger. The mountain man who'd left civilization behind. "We'll gather at the house," James announced loudly, though his eyes slid past Caleb, to settle matters. The family parlor felt smaller than Caleb remembered. The familiar sense of beeswax and wood smoke couldn't mask the tension. He perched awkwardly on the edge of a delicate chair, feeling like a bear in a china shop. The ticking of the mantel clock counted out the uncomfortable silence. James cleared his throat, producing an envelope from his vest pocket. "Now then, to business." He pulled out a yellow document. "As executor of Father's will, I've divided things fairly among us all." The others nodded, already knowing their shares. Choice farmland, town properties, family heirlooms. And for Caleb, James's lips twisted in what might have been a smile. The deed to the Boone mine. Laughter rippled through the room. Caleb's chest tightened. The mine had been abandoned years ago, worked out and worthless. Even he knew that much. "Seems fitting," his brother William drawled, "seeing as you prefer rocks and dirt to decent company." More laughter. Martha at least had the grace to look away. Caleb stood, his chair scraping against the floor. The room fell silent. He could feel the old anger rising, the urge to show them just what a mountain man could do, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "Much?" "Obliged," he said quietly, plucking the deed from James's fingers. His voice was rough from disuse. "Reckon that settles things." He didn't wait for more mockery. The night air felt clean after the stuffiness of the parlor. Rather than seek a proper bed, he made his way to the barn. The hayloft had always been more comfortable than those fussy feather mattresses anyway. As he settled into the familiar scratchy hay, voices drifted up from below. His siblings, heading home after their evening of spite. Can you believe he actually took it? That was William. What else could he do? James replied, "It's all he deserves. Nothing." Their laughter faded into the darkness. Caleb pulled the deed from his coat, studying it by moonlight. Worthless or not, it was land of his own. Far from here, far from their judgment and scorn, he'd made his bed. In worse places than a hayloft. The barn cats remembered him at least. one curling up near his boots. Sleep came slowly as he listened to the night sounds, crickets chirping, horses shifting in their stalls, the soft rustle of hay dot when dawn painted the eastern sky pink. Caleb was already moving. He'd learned long ago that early rising meant avoiding unwanted company. His horse nickered a greeting as he entered the stable. "Ready for a long ride, old friend?" He ran a gentle hand down the horse's neck. The animal had been his only constant companion these past years. The saddle creaked as he tightened the cinch. Every motion was familiar, practiced. His few possessions fit easily in the saddlebags. The deed he tucked carefully inside his coat, close to his heart. Let them laugh. Let them think they'd given him nothing. He'd build something of his own, out where a man was judged by his actions rather than his manners. Find some dignity in honest work, even if it was just scratching in the dirt of a played-out mine. The morning mist still clung to the valley as Caleb pointed his horse westward. He didn't look back at the town, at the steeple where they'd buried his father, at the fine houses where his siblings slept in their soft beds. His path led forward, toward the mountains painted gold by the rising sun. The steady clip-clop of hooves marked the beginning of his journey. Another lonely trail, but this time toward something that was his alone. Whatever lay ahead, he'd face it on his own terms. The autumn wind cut sharper in the Colorado highlands, whipping through Caleb's worn coat as his horse picked its way along the steep mountain trail. Weeks of hard travel had left both man and beast trail-weary. They'd followed wagon trains when convenient, camped alone when necessary, always pushing westward. The mining town hunched in the valley below like a scatter of wooden blocks. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the clang of hammers echoed off the mountainsides. Caleb urged his horse down the switchbacking trail, his shoulders tensing as he approached civilization. The main street was little more than a muddy tract, lined with false-fronted buildings. Shopkeepers paused in their sweeping to eye his ragged coat and rifle. A group of miners whispered as he passed, noting his wild appearance and the mountain dust coating his clothes. The general store's bell jangled as Caleb ducked through the door. The shopkeeper's friendly greeting died when he saw Caleb's scarred face and wary stance. "Need flour and beans," Caleb said, his voice rough from disuse. He placed worn coins on the counter and directions to the boom mine. The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose as he measured out the supplies. "Boom mine? That old thing's been abandoned going on 3 years now. Cabins up there are falling to pieces." "That so?" Caleb kept his voice neutral. Ridges played out completely. The man shook his head. "Nothing left but fool's gold and broken dreams up there." A few old-timers by the stove chimed in with their own warnings. The mine had never produced much. The supports were rotting. Winter would make the trail impassable. Caleb listened silently, loading his purchases into his saddlebags. The deed in his coat seemed to weigh heavier with each dire prediction. But he hadn't come all this way to turn back now. The trail to the mine wound up through stands of pine and aspen. Their golden leaves fluttered in the chill breeze as shadows lengthened across the valley. Caleb's horse picked its way carefully over loose rocks and exposed roots dot as the sun dipped toward the western peaks. He finally spotted the mine entrance, a dark slash in the granite face. Weather-grade cabins huddled nearby, their windows dark. All matched the townsfolk's gloomy descriptions dot except for one thing. Smoke curled from the chimney of the largest cabin. Caleb's hand moved to his pistol as he dismounted. He'd dealt with claim jumpers before. The cabin door creaked as he approached, gun drawn but pointed down. "Hello, the house," he called gruffly. The door opened, revealing a woman in her late 20s, her dark hair tucked beneath a faded bonnet. She showed no fear at his weapon, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm Eliza Harland," she said, "and you must be Mr. Boone." Caleb blinked in surprise. Behind her, he glimpsed two children, a serious-faced boy of about 12 and a younger girl, both with the copper skin and dark eyes that marked their Apache heritage. "How did you? The deed holder's name is on the claim post." She gestured to a weathered wooden marker. Though we weren't expecting anyone to actually come, the boy moved protectively closer to his sister, watching Caleb with wary eyes. The girl half hid behind her brother, but curiosity showed in her face. "I'm Joseph," the boy said. "This is my sister Mara." Caleb slowly holstered his pistol. "The mine's mine now. My inheritance. We have nowhere else to go," Eliza said simply. "I was teaching at the mission school when Joseph and Mara's parents died. When the school closed, we came here. The cabin was empty." Her voice trailed off, but her chin remained high. The children pressed closer to her sides. Caleb looked at them. The proud widow, the protective brother, the shy sister. Then at the darkening sky and his tired horse. "Reckon you can stay." "For?" "Tonight at least." The words came out gruffer than he meant. Relief softened Eliza's features. "You're welcome to share our fire and supper." Inside, the cabin was humble but neat. A pot of beans simmered on the cook stove. Mara and Joseph spread their bedrolls near the hearth, while Eliza added another log to the fire. Caleb sat in a corner, the deed spread on his knee. The firelight caught the children's faces as they drifted to sleep. Joseph's arm draped protectively over his sister, even in slumber. He studied the paper that had brought him here, wondering what exactly he'd walked into. The worthless mine had become someone's home. These strangers had found refuge in his inheritance. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing on the walls. Across the room, Eliza quietly mended clothing by the lamp's glow, her needle flashing in and out of worn fabric. Neither spoke, letting the night sounds of the mountain fill the silence. The morning sun crept through gaps in the cabin's weathered shutters, painting thin stripes of light across the plank floor. Caleb woke to the soft crackle of a freshly built fire and the scent of coffee. Eliza stood at the cook stove, her movements quiet and efficient as she worked. "Thank you," she said softly, not turning around, "for letting us stay the night." Caleb grunted, pushing himself up from his bedroll. He wasn't used to conversation first thing in the morning. Or any time, really. The children stirred as well. Joseph immediately alert while Mara blinked sleepily. Eliza set about making corn cakes on the griddle, the batter sizzling as it hit the hot iron. "I know this is your property now," Eliza said as she worked, "but I'd like to propose an arrangement. I can keep teaching the children, tend to the cabin, make it a proper home, in exchange for shelter." Caleb watched her steady hands flip the corn cakes. "Ain't much of a home," he said gruffly. "It could be." Her voice held quiet determination. "With some work." After breakfast, Caleb took his lantern to examine the mine shaft. The entrance had partially collapsed, requiring him to duck under fallen timbers. Inside, the air hung thick with dust and memories of broken dreams. His light revealed what the townspeople had said. The veins were played out, leaving nothing but worthless rock behind. But the main support beams were solid oak, still strong despite the years. With proper repairs, the shaft could be made safe. Again. Not for mining, perhaps, but for storage at least. When he emerged into the sunlight, he found Joseph watching him intently. "Need firewood," Caleb said simply, reaching for his axe. The boy grabbed a smaller hatchet without being asked and fell into step beside him. They worked in companionable silence, the rhythmic thunk of their tools echoing off the mountainside. Joseph was strong for his age, determined to prove his worth. When they paused to rest, Caleb noticed the boy studying his technique, adjusting his own grip to match. Back at the cabin, Eliza had set up a makeshift school. Mara sat at the rough table, carefully copying letters onto a slate while her teacher praised her progress. The girl's face glowed at each word of encouragement. Caleb hefted the water buckets, heading down to the spring. The path was steep, but well-worn, showing how many trips Eliza must have made. As he filled the buckets, he thought about her teaching the children despite their circumstances. Her dress might be patched and faded, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. The afternoon sun was lowering when hoofbeats approached the cabin. A rider appeared, leading a pack mule. Eliza hurried out to meet him, accepting a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "The books finally came," she exclaimed, her face lighting up as she unwrapped several worn schoolbooks. "I wrote to the mission weeks ago, hoping they might spare what they could." Caleb watched her lovingly smooth the cracked spines. These weren't just books to her. They were tools for building a future. She believed in possibilities, even here in this abandoned place. That evening, Eliza served up a hearty stew of beans and dried meat. The cabin felt different somehow, warmer, despite the mountain chill seeping through the walls. Mara hummed softly as she helped clear the dishes. Joseph discussed the day's woodcutting with pride. Eliza smiled at them both, her eyes tired but content. Caleb sat in his corner, turning his coffee cup in rough hands. The familiar silence felt strange now, filled with small domestic sounds he'd long forgotten. The scrape of spoons, children's whispers, a woman's gentle instructions. Part of him wanted to retreat to his solitude, yet something held him there, unwilling to break this unexpected peace. He watched the firelight play across their faces, the boy's serious expression so like a man's, the girl's shy smile, the quiet strength in Eliza's bearing. They weren't what he'd expected to find at the end of his long journey west. But perhaps, like the mine's sturdy timbers hidden beneath the collapse, there was value here that couldn't be measured in gold. The morning air carried a crisp bite. As Caleb worked, his axe striking rhythmically against the pine rails he was splitting. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cool temperature, and wooden splinters littered the ground around his feet. The steady work felt good, honest, a way to forget the strangeness of sharing his cabin with others. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke his concentration. Caleb straightened, gripping his axe tighter as a well-dressed man rode into view. The stranger's coat was too fine for these parts, and his saddlebags bulged with what looked like official documents. "Good morning," the rider called out, dismounting smoothly. "I'm Mr. Harcourt from the Territorial Office, U.S. Geological Survey." He produced a badge that glinted in the morning light. Caleb nodded warily, not loosening his grip on the axe. "What brings you up here?" "Recording abandoned claims in the area." Harcourt pulled out a leather-bound notebook. "I understand this is the boom mine?" "That's right." Caleb watched as the surveyor walked toward the mine entrance, making careful notes. Through the cabin's open door, he could see Eliza pause in her teaching, attention caught by the visitor's presence. The children huddled closer to her, instinctively. Harcourt spent nearly an hour examining the mine shaft and the surrounding ridge, measuring and documenting with practiced efficiency. His serious expression and thorough inspection set Caleb's nerves on edge. Finally, Caleb could stand it no longer. He strode over to where Harcourt was studying the rock face. "Mind telling me what's so interesting about an empty mine?" Harcourt looked up from his notebook, adjusting his spectacles. "Recent geological studies suggest this ridge system may have unexpected potential." He lowered his voice. "There are indications of deeper gold deposits that earlier mining techniques couldn't reach." Caleb's heart thudded against his ribs. "You saying there's still gold here?" "I'm saying you should file that deed at the county office immediately." Harcourt's eyes were sharp behind his glasses. "Secure your legal rights before word gets out." A small gasp made them both turn. Eliza stood nearby, her face drained of color. She'd clearly heard every word. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her skirts and hurried back to the cabin. Harcourt mounted his horse, tucking away his notebook. "I'll need to return for further surveys," he said. "Good day, Mr. Boone." He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Caleb staring after him with a mixture of hope and dread. The rest of the afternoon passed in uneasy silence. Caleb paced the ridge, studying the ground with new eyes. Was Harcourt telling the truth, or spinning tailies to serve some hidden purpose? "Could be he's playing me for a fool," Caleb muttered aloud, running his hand along the weather-worn timbers of the mine entrance. Wouldn't be the first time someone's tried. Yet something in the surveyor's manner had seemed genuine. His careful measurements, his detailed notes, those weren't the actions of a man spinning lies as darkness fell. Caleb lingered outside the cabin, unwilling to face the worry he'd seen in Eliza's eyes. Through the window, he could hear her voice, soft and steady, leading the children in evening prayers. "Lord, protect this home and all who dwell here," she whispered. "Keep us safe from harm and guide us in your wisdom." A simple faith in her words made Caleb's chest tighten. He hadn't prayed himself in years, but he recognized the tone of someone who truly believed in divine protection. Unable to settle, he walked the ridge under the rising moon. Silver light painted the mountainside in stark shadows, making the mine entrance look like a dark mouth ready to swallow secrets or spill them. His father's worthless gift might be valuable after. All but at what cost? The night wind whispered through the pines, carrying hints of winter's approach. Caleb stood at the edge of the ridge, staring down at the mine shaft. The dark opening seemed to stare back, holding either promise or threat. He couldn't tell which. Fear coiled in his stomach, not for himself, but for the fragile peace he'd found in this unexpected household. His eyes traced the familiar path back to the cabin, where a single candle still burned in the window. The light looked warm, welcoming, everything the cold mine shaft wasn't. He'd come west seeking solitude and dignity. Instead, he'd found something that felt almost like family. Now gold threatened to destroy it all. 2 days after Harcourt's visit, Caleb saddled his horse before dawn. The deed felt heavy in his coat pocket as he rode down the mountain trail toward town. Eliza stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill, watching until he disappeared around the bend. The county office was a weathered building with warped floorboards that creaked under Caleb's boots. Behind a high desk, the clerk peered at him through wire-rimmed spectacles, lips pursed as he examined the deed. "Boom mine, eh?" The clerk's tone dripped with skepticism. He held the paper to the light, squinting. "Mighty interesting timing, filing this now." Caleb kept his voice steady. "Just want everything proper and legal." The clerk's stamp came down, with unnecessary force, leaving an official mark that declared Caleb's ownership. But as he left the office, Caleb noticed heads turning, conversations dropping to whispers. Word was spreading faster than autumn wildfire in the general store. He heard 2 men muttering about gold in the ridge and that mountain man's claim. Outside the saloon, a group of miners fell silent as he passed, their eyes following him with naked greed. The sun was setting by the time Caleb reached the cabin. Lamplight glowed in the windows, and he could hear Eliza's voice leading the children in their evening lessons. The peaceful scene was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. "Hey, mountain man." Rough voices carried through the dusk. "Come out and talk." Caleb dismounted slowly, grabbing his rifle from its scabbard. 5 riders emerged from the shadows, their horses stamping nervously in the yard. "Heard you stole this here claim," one called out. "Ain't right, one man hoarding all that gold." "This is legal property," Caleb said firmly, raising his rifle. "Best ride on." The men's jeering laughter cut through the night air. "Legal, he says. Won't be legal long, friend." Inside the cabin, Caleb heard Mara whimper. Eliza's soft voice whispered comfort, but fear threaded through her words. Last warning. Caleb chambered around, the sound sharp and clear. Get off my land. The riders hesitated, then wheeled their horses around. This ain't over, one shouted back. That ridge belongs to whoever's strong enough to hold it. After they left, Caleb found Eliza holding both children close. Joseph's face was buried in her skirts, while Mara's eyes were wide with terror. My family thought they were giving me nothing, Caleb muttered, setting his rifle by the door. Now their cruel joke might bring worse than being poor. He ran a hand through his hair. Might bring killing. The next morning, Caleb rode into town for supplies, his spirits heavy. Outside the telegraph office, a well-dressed man held court with a group of eager listeners. His tailored suit and gold watch chain marked him as someone important. Denver. Pacific Railroad has plans for this whole region, the man was saying. Any improperly filed claims will naturally be absorbed by the mining syndicate. Progress can't be stopped by mountain squatters. Caleb recognized the threat in those smooth words. The man caught his eye and smiled coldly, clearly knowing exactly who Caleb was. Loading his saddlebags with supplies took longer than usual. Every shopkeeper seemed to have questions about the mine, thinly disguised as casual conversation. By the time Caleb started home, his jaw ached from clenching his teeth. The sound of singing drew him to a stop as he approached the cabin. Eliza's clear voice lifted in an old hymn, the children's smaller voices following her lead. Through the window, he could see them gathered around her as she pointed to words in a songbook, teaching them to read along with the verses. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The simple beauty of the scene twisted something in Caleb's chest. These people trusted him, depended on him. But staying meant facing violence from desperate men and legal attacks from powerful ones. Maybe it would be better to leave now before things got worse. That evening, after the children were asleep, Caleb sat at the rough-hewn table. The lamplight cast long shadows as he methodically cleaned his rifle, oiling each part with careful attention. The familiar task couldn't quiet his troubled thoughts. The weapon gleamed in the dim light, both protection and burden. Like the mine itself, it represented both promise and threat, the means to defend his new family, or the instrument that might bring their destruction. Dawn crept over the mountain ridge, painting the frost-covered ground in pale golden light. Caleb moved quietly through the stable, cinching his horse's saddle with practiced motions. His breath came out in white puffs as he worked, mind set on the long road ahead. Better to leave now, he thought, before anyone else got hurt because of him. He'd left a small pile of coins on the table inside, enough to see Eliza and the children through a few weeks. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer. The memory of last night's threats still rang in his ears, mixing with the echoes of his siblings' mockery. Perhaps they'd been right about him all along. The stable door creaked, and tiny footsteps padded across the dirt floor. Caleb turned to find Mara standing there in her nightdress, her dark eyes wide with understanding beyond her 8 years. "You're leaving us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before he could respond, she ran forward and grabbed his coat with both hands, pressing her face against the rough wool. "Please don't go. Please don't leave us alone." Caleb's hands hung uselessly at his sides, his heart clenching at the child's desperate plea. He opened his mouth to offer some gentle excuse, but another voice cut through the morning air. "So this is your answer?" Eliza stood in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl against the cold. Her words were quiet but carried steel beneath them. "Honey, run away when things grow difficult. I'm protecting you," Caleb said gruffly, though the words felt hollow even to his ears. "Those men mean business. The railroad means worse. And we'll face them alone if you go," Eliza replied firmly. "But I thought you were different from those who abandoned these children before." Her gray eyes held his, unflinching. "I thought you might be a man who'd stand his ground." Mara's small fingers still clutched his coat, and suddenly Caleb remembered his father's words from long ago. "True courage ain't about being fearless, boy. It's about being scared clean through and standing firm anyway." He'd spent years running from those words, from any responsibility that might bind him to others. But now, looking down at Mara's tear-streaked face and meeting Eliza's steady gaze, something shifted inside him. With gentle hands, he loosened Mara's grip and knelt before her. "Ain't going nowhere," he said softly. "Reckon we got work to do." Here, the smile that broke across the child's face was like sunshine after storm clouds. She threw her arms around his neck, and for once, Caleb didn't stiffen at the contact. They spent the day fortifying the cabin. Caleb showed Joseph how to reinforce the door hinges with extra iron plates he'd bought in town. Together they hung the heavy new door he'd been saving for winter, its solid oak planks a sturdy barrier against trouble. Eliza and Mara gathered firewood while the men worked, stacking it high against the cabin's western wall. The pile grew steadily, enough to last through the coldest months ahead. Caleb watched them work, noting how Eliza taught the girl to check each piece for dryness, to stack it properly so air could flow between the logs. As evening approached, Eliza called them all inside. She'd set the rough-hewn table with their best tin plates, and a single candle burned in the center, a luxury she must have been saving. The beans were simple fare, but she'd baked fresh bread that filled the cabin with its homey scent. "A proper supper," she declared, "for our family." The word family caught Caleb off guard, but before he could dwell on it, the children began pestering him for stories. He stumbled through a tale about tracking a clever fox through winter snow, his telling awkward and halting. But Joseph and Mara hung on every word, giggling at his clumsy attempts at different voices for the animals. Caleb couldn't remember the last time he'd heard children laugh. Real, carefree laughter that held no mockery. It stirred something deep in his chest, something he'd thought long buried. Later, after the children had drifted off to sleep in their corner, Eliza approached where he sat by the fire. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying, for choosing us." Caleb nodded, not trusting himself to speak. But as she turned away, he felt the last of his walls crumbling. For the first time since he was a boy, he felt like he belonged somewhere, like he was a man with a true home, not just a place to sleep. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting warm light across the sleeping children's faces. Outside, the wind whistled through the pines, but inside the reinforced cabin, all was peaceful. Caleb sat in his chair, keeping watch, his heart fuller than he'd ever thought possible. The first snowflakes began drifting down as November settled over the Colorado highlands. They dusted the ridge like powdered sugar, transforming the rugged landscape into something gentler. Inside the cabin, the rhythmic thud of axes echoed through the clearing as Caleb and Joseph worked side by side, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. "Stack them tight against the wall," Caleb instructed, showing Joseph how to wedge each log securely. The boy nodded seriously, his dark eyes intent on the task. Day after day, their woodpile grew higher, insurance against the long winter ahead. Inside the cabin, Eliza and Mara huddled near the window where the light was strongest. Their fingers moved steadily, patching worn shirts and mending split seams. Eliza had taught Mara to make tiny, even stitches, and the girl's tongue poked out in concentration as she worked. When evening drew in, they gathered around the stone fireplace, its warmth a barrier against the growing cold. Eliza would open one of the precious schoolbooks, her clear voice bringing the stories to life. Caleb found himself looking forward to these quiet moments, watching the firelight dance across their faces as they listened. "Mr. Boone," Mara would call him now, tugging at his sleeve to show him her letters or a new stitch she'd learned. The title felt strange at first, too formal for a rough mountain man, but he grew to treasure it. It meant belonging, respect, things he'd never thought to have again. One Sunday morning, as they finished their breakfast of cornmeal mush, Eliza smoothed her faded dress and cleared her throat. "I think we should attend church today," she said. Softly, "the children need to know they're part of the community." Caleb's first instinct was to refuse. He hadn't set foot in a church since leaving home, and the thought of facing the townspeople's judgment made his stomach clench. But seeing the hope in Eliza's eyes, he couldn't say no. They walked into town together, the children scrubbed clean, and wearing their best clothes. Whispers followed them as they entered the small wooden church. Caleb felt every eye upon them, heard the murmurs about the Indian children and the strange mountain man. But the circuit preacher met them at the door with genuine warmth, pressing hymnals into their hands. "Welcome, friends," he said, including them all in his smile. "We're blessed to have you join us today." When the singing began, Caleb stood silent at first. The familiar words stuck in his throat. But Mara's clear voice rose beside him, pure and unafraid, and something broke loose in his chest. His own voice emerged, rough and uncertain, joining the chorus of Amazing Grace. The hymn carried him back to childhood memories of his mother's voice, of belonging somewhere. After the service, several townswomen approached Eliza, offering sympathetic smiles and invitations to sewing circles. But their eyes slid past Joseph and Mara as if the children were invisible. Others made no effort to hide their disapproval, gathering in clusters to whisper and stare. The walk home seemed longer than usual. Snow had begun falling again, thick flakes swirling in the afternoon light. Caleb noticed Eliza's shoulders shaking slightly, though she tried to hide her tears. "They'll never accept them, will they?" she whispered, watching Joseph and Mara trudge through the deepening snow ahead of them. "No matter how well they learn, how hard they try." Caleb stopped, turning to face her. "Listen here," he said firmly, his voice low and intense. "I ain't much for promises, but I'm making one now. Long as I draw breath, I'll stand by you and these children, don't matter what anyone else thinks or says." Eliza's eyes met his, filled with gratitude and something deeper that made his heart skip. Before he could ponder it further, Mara's tired voice broke the moment. "My feet are cold, Mr. Boone." Without hesitation, Caleb swung the girl onto his shoulders. She giggled, clutching his hair for balance. Joseph, trying to maintain his dignity, but clearly also tired, moved closer until his small hand gripped Caleb's coat sleeve. Together they walked through the swirling snow, their boots leaving tracks that would soon be covered by fresh powder. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the white ground, but ahead, smoke rose steadily from their cabin's chimney, promising warmth and shelter from more than just the cold. Hoofbeats echoed through the crisp mountain air 1 week. Later, drawing Caleb's attention from the woodpile, 3 riders approached up the narrow trail, their badges glinting in the winter sun. Sheriff Duggan led the way, his weathered face set in hard lines as he reined his horse to a stop in front of the cabin. Eliza appeared in the doorway, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. Joseph stood protectively near his sister, who peered around him with wide eyes. "Mr. Boone," the sheriff drawled, not bothering to dismount. "Got some business to discuss with you about this here property." Caleb set down his axe carefully, keeping his voice level. "What kind of business, Sheriff?" "Been looking over the deed records." Duggan pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Seems there might be some irregularities in your claim. Mining syndicate out of Denver's mighty interested in these parts nowadays." "My deed's proper filed," Caleb said firmly. "Saw to it myself at the county office." The sheriff's mouth twisted. Maybe so. But competing claims could tie things up in territorial court for months, years even. Might be best to consider your options before things get complicated. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. He took a step forward, but Eliza's gentle touch on his arm stopped him. Her eyes met his, steady and warning. "We appreciate the information, Sheriff," she said clearly. "We'll give it proper consideration." Duggan's gaze flickered between them, calculating. "See that you do. Hate to see anyone get hurt over a misunderstanding about property rights." He touched his hat brim and wheeled his horse around, his deputies following without a word. They watched until the riders disappeared down the trail. "Old DeBray's." Only then did Caleb let out the breath he'd been holding. "You were right to hold back," Eliza said softly. "Violence would only make things worse." That evening, as Eliza prepared their simple supper of beans and cornbread, Joseph helped Caleb check the cabin's door hinges. The boy worked quietly for a while before speaking. "Mr. Boone?" he asked, his young face serious. "If there's gold in the mine, does that mean we'll be rich?" Caleb set down his tools, considering how to answer. "Truth is, Joseph, I've seen what gold fever does to men. Makes them forget what's really valuable." He gestured toward the cabin where Mara was helping Eliza set the table. "Ain't no fortune worth more than honest work. Keeping faith with those who depend on you and standing loyal by them that stand by you." Joseph nodded slowly, understanding in his dark eyes. "Like family?" "Like family," Caleb agreed, surprised by how right the word felt. A rider appeared just before sunset, delivering a telegram from Denver. Caleb opened the yellow envelope with rough fingers, reading the message twice. The syndicate offered $5,000 for immediate sale of the mine and property, more money than he'd ever seen. Without a word, he walked to the fireplace and dropped the telegram into the flames. Eliza watched it curl and blacken, but didn't ask what it had said. Some things didn't need explaining. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Caleb found Eliza sitting alone on the rough-hewn porch. Stars sparkled in the crystal-clear mountain sky, and her breath made soft clouds in the cold air. He settled beside her, neither speaking for a long while. "I keep thinking about losing it all," Eliza finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After Thomas, my husband, died in that railroad accident, everything I had built just crumbled away. The children were all I had left." She wrapped her shawl tighter. "I don't know if I can face that emptiness again." Caleb stared out into the darkness, remembering his own losses, his years of lonely wandering. Without conscious thought, his hand moved to cover hers, where it rested on the rough wood between them. Her fingers were cold, but they curled naturally into his warm grip. The simple touch startled them both. Caleb almost pulled away, but something in the quiet moment held him still. They sat together under the vast sweep of stars, their joined hands a silent promise stronger than any deed or claim. Sunday dawned bright and cold, frost glittering on the cabin windows. Eliza hummed hymns while kneading bread dough, her spirits high despite Caleb's brooding presence at the door. "Neighbors need to know we're decent folk," she insisted, shaping another loaf. "Breaking bread together builds trust." Caleb grunted, unconvinced. "Ain't sure about opening our door so wide, given recent troubles." "That's exactly why we should," Eliza countered, her hands steady on the dough. "Fear and suspicion only grow in darkness. Let's bring some light in." By afternoon, delicious smells filled the cabin. Mara had helped arrange wildflowers in tin cups, while Joseph proudly displayed his new reading primer on the shelf. Caleb, despite his reservations, had swept the porch and set out extra chairs. The first guests arrived as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. The Miller family brought an apple pie, still warm from their oven. The widow Carson carried fresh-baked bread wrapped in clean cloth. Even the blacksmith and his wife came, bearing a pot of beans seasoned with salt pork. At first, conversation stayed stilted and polite. Folks perched uncertainly on chairs and benches, casting curious glances around the once abandoned cabin. But when Eliza began serving food, the atmosphere softened. Children's laughter broke through the awkwardness as Mara showed her slate drawings to the Miller girls. After the meal, Eliza brought out her hymnal. Her clear voice lifted in amazing grace, and soon others joined in. Joseph and Mara knew all the words, their young voices pure and strong. Caleb stayed silent but found his foot tapping along. The circuit preacher, who had ridden up from town, listened with a gentle smile. When the hymn ended, he stood and raised his hands. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying easily through the cabin, "I see something mighty special here tonight. This place was abandoned, left to ruin. But look now, warm hearts, full bellies, children's laughter. The Lord surely can bring light from abandoned places." Caleb felt those words strike deep in his chest, like an arrow finding its mark. He looked around the cabin at the families gathered close, at Joseph helping serve pie to the elderly widow Carson, at Eliza's face glowing in the lamplight. This was more than just shelter from the cold. This was home. The evening stretched on pleasantly, with more hymns and scripture recitations from the children. Even some of the most suspicious townspeople began to unbend, trading stories and asking Caleb about his plans for spring planting. None of them noticed the dark figure watching from the tree line, his face harsh in the gathering dusk. After the last guest departed, trailing lantern light down the snowy path, Caleb stepped onto the porch to bring in more firewood. A paper fluttered in the wind, nailed to the doorframe. He tore it down quickly, moving into the lamplight to read. "Clear. Out by spring thaw, or we'll clear you out. This is your only warning." The threat was unsigned, but Caleb knew the source. His jaw tightened as he crumpled the paper and shoved it deep in his pocket. Inside, he could hear Eliza laughing with the children as they cleaned up from supper. He wouldn't spoil their joy with this shadow, not tonight. Later, after the cabin had grown quiet and the children were tucked into their beds, Caleb settled onto the porch with his rifle across his knees. Snow began falling softly, each flake catching the dim light from the cabin windows before settling into the growing white blanket below. He watched the darkness beyond the clearing, alert for any movement. The threat burned in his pocket like a coal, but his heart felt strangely peaceful. The preacher's words echoed in his mind, light from abandoned places. Looking back through the window, he could see Eliza banking the fire for the night, her movements gentle in the fading glow. Something worth protecting had grown here. In this place, his family had mockingly discarded. Something worth fighting for. The snow continued falling as Caleb kept his vigil, a silent guardian in the deepening night. The winter morning dawned bitter cold as Caleb rode into town for supplies. His breath frosted in the air while his horses' hooves crunched through crusty snow. The streets were quiet, most folks still huddled by their morning fires. He had just finished loading flour and coffee into his saddlebags when heavy footsteps approached from behind. Before he could turn, rough hands grabbed his shoulders. "You're under arrest, Boone," growled Deputy Wilson, shoving him against the general store's wall. Another deputy quickly stripped away Caleb's gun belt. "What's the meaning of this?" Caleb demanded, struggling as they bound his wrists with rope. "Claim jumping," Deputy Wilson sneered. "Got evidence you forged that deed of yours." They marched him through the streets, past gawking townspeople, to the sheriff's office. The cell they threw him into was ice cold, its thin blanket offering little comfort against the winter chill seeping through stone walls. Sheriff Duggan sat at his desk, boots propped up, examining Caleb's deed with exaggerated care. "Seems there's some irregularities with this document," he drawled. "New evidence has come to light questioning its authenticity." "That deed's legitimate," Caleb growled. My father left it to me himself." The sheriff's only response was a dismissive wave as he locked the deed in his desk drawer. An hour later, Caleb heard familiar voices approaching. Eliza burst through the door. Joseph and Mara closed behind her, their cheeks red from running through the cold. "This is outrageous," Eliza declared, drawing herself up tall before the sheriff's desk. "You know that deed is genuine. Release him at once." Sheriff Duggan barely glanced up from his paperwork. "Ma'am, this is a legal matter. Best take those children home where they belong." "We belong with Mr. Boone," Mara said firmly, though her lower lip trembled. The sheriff's face hardened. "Get them out of here," he ordered the deputy. "We'll be back," Eliza promised Caleb as they were ushered out. Her eyes blazed with determination, even as Joseph had to help guide a crying Mara toward the door. The afternoon dragged into evening. Caleb paced his cell, 7 steps each way, while winter darkness crept over the town. The jail grew quieter, with only the occasional crackle of the pot-bellied stove breaking the silence. Footsteps in the corridor made him look up. Eliza had returned alone, her spine straight as steel as she confronted Sheriff Duggan at his desk. "I know what's really happening here," she said, her voice low but carrying clearly to Caleb's cell. "The mining syndicate paid you to do this. They want our land, and you're helping them steal it." The sheriff's chair creaked as he leaned back. "Careful with those accusations, Mom. Wouldn't want to find yourself facing charges, too." "The Lord sees what you're doing," Eliza replied steadily. "There will be a reckoning." Outside the jail's window, Caleb caught fragments of conversation from passing townspeople. Joseph and Mara huddled beneath the sill, listening intently. Auction off that mine claim within weeks. Syndicates already drawing up the papers. Them. Orphans will have to move on. Mara began to cry softly. Joseph wrapped an arm around his sister, his young face tight with worry. Eliza hurried to comfort them both, gathering them close. "Don't you fret," she whispered. "We won't abandon Mr. Boone, and he won't abandon us. The Lord will make a way." She led them to the cell where Caleb stood gripping the iron bars. In the dim lamplight, her face was worn but determined as she knelt with the children. "Dear Father in heaven," she prayed, her voice steady despite the tears sliding down her cheeks. "We ask for your justice and mercy. Protect those who are wrongly accused. Give us strength to stand firm in faith. Show us your path through this valley of shadows." Caleb watched her through the bars, shame and wonder mixing in his chest. Here was a woman who had lost everything once before, yet still trusted in God's providence. Her faith burned bright and true, like a beacon in the gathering dark. For the first time since boyhood, Caleb felt his own head bow. His lips moved in. A whispered prayer, clumsy with long disuse. "Lord," he breathed, so quiet only he could hear, "help me be worthy of such faith." The jail cell remained cold, but something warm kindled in Caleb's heart. A spark of hope, born from Eliza's unwavering trust in divine justice. As night settled over the town, that spark glowed like a promise in the darkness. The morning sun cast long shadows through the jail's barred windows as Caleb stretched his aching muscles. A night on the hard cell floor had left him stiff and weary. Outside, he heard the usual morning bustle of townsfolk going about their business. Suddenly, shouts erupted from the street. A commanding voice cut through the noise, speaking words Caleb couldn't understand. Heavy boots stomped up the jail's wooden steps, and the door burst open. A tall Apache warrior stood in the doorway, his dark eyes scanning the room with fierce intensity. His buckskins and blanket were dusty from hard riding, and a Winchester rifle hung at his side. Sheriff Duggan jumped to his feet, hand hovering near his pistol. "I am Greyhawk," the warrior announced in clear English. "Where are my sister's children?" Caleb's heart sank. This must be Joseph and Mara's uncle, come to claim them. He pressed against the bars, straining to hear what followed. Before the sheriff could respond, Eliza hurried through the door. "Greyhawk." "Please," she said, reaching toward him. "Let me explain." The warrior turned to her, his expression stern. "You have kept my bloodkin from their people." "This is not right. I've kept them safe," Eliza insisted. "They're learning to read and write. They have a home, food, warmth. With a man who steals land?" Greyhawk gestured toward Caleb's cell. "Who takes what is not his?" "The mine is rightfully his," Eliza said firmly. "These charges are false. Come see for yourself how the children live." Greyhawk studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Show me." As they left, Caleb slumped against the cell wall. Two rough-looking men in the adjacent cell watched with interest. "That's bad luck, friend," one said. "Apache testimony carries weight the territorial judge these days. If that warrior speaks against you, or for you," the other prisoner added. "Heard tell of cases turned by Indian witnesses. Might be your salvation or your doom." The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Through his window, Caleb watched the winter sun arc across the sky, imagination torturing him with visions of the children being taken away. As evening approached, he caught glimpses of Eliza leading Greyhawk toward the cabin. The warrior walked tall and proud, his rifle still ready at his side. Hours later, Eliza returned to the jail. Though exhausted, her eyes held hope. Greyhawk saw the children. She told Caleb softly through the bars. They ran to him with joy. But when he spoke of leaving, they clung to me. They begged to stay, called you family. Caleb's throat tightened. And what did he say to that? He watched them all evening, how they helped with chores, recite their lessons, sing their hymns. Joseph showed him the woodpile you two split together. Mara insisted he see her slate with perfect letters. Eliza's voice wavered. They wouldn't let go of either of us, Caleb. They kept saying we're all family now. That touched him? Caleb asked. I saw his face soften when Mara sang the hymn you taught her. Eliza smiled faintly, but he's torn. He says he must speak with the territorial judge before deciding. Through the gathering darkness, Caleb watched Eliza walk Greyhawk back toward town. Their figures were silhouetted against the rising winter. Moon the schoolteacher and the warrior, moving in respectful silence. Eliza's lips moved in silent prayer as they walked, asking for wisdom and mercy to guide Greyhawk's heart. The fate of their fragile family hung in the balance with each step. Caleb stood at his window long after they disappeared from view, his own prayers joining Eliza's beneath the cold, bright stars. Everything now depended on whether Greyhawk would see the truth of their love for Joseph and Mara, and whether that truth would be enough to save them all. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the jail's barred windows, casting long shadows. Across the cold floor of Caleb's cell, the creak of boots on wooden steps announced another visitor. This time, it was the circuit preacher, carrying his warm Bible and a gentle smile. "Brother Boone," the preacher said softly, pulling up a chair outside the cell. "I heard about your troubles." Caleb turned from the window, his shoulders heavy. "Reckon you've come to tell me it's God's will." "I've come to sit with you," the preacher replied, opening his Bible, "and perhaps to share some words that might bring comfort." The cell felt smaller as Caleb paced, his voice bitter. "Comfort? My own family gave me this mine as a mockery. Now I'm charged with stealing it." He gripped the bars. "Seems I'm cursed. To be despised wherever I go." The preacher nodded thoughtfully, turning pages in his Bible. "You know, our Lord Jesus himself was despised and rejected by men. A man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. His weathered finger traced the verses, yet he bore it all for the sake of others." Something in those words pierced Caleb's heart. He sank onto the narrow cot, head bowed. "Your worth isn't measured in gold, son," the preacher continued, "nor in your brother's approval. Look at the family God has placed in your care. A widow teaching his word. Children finding their way to him through song and scripture. Caleb's chest tightened as tears welled up unexpectedly. I failed them. I'm locked in here while they face danger alone. Christ felt abandoned too, the preacher said gently. But through his surrender came victory. Sometimes our darkest moments lead us back to light. The words broke something inside Caleb. Years of bitterness and hurt spilled out as he wept, the preacher's hand reaching through the bars to rest on his shoulder. Across town, Eliza stood her ground before the syndicate foreman outside the general store. Her voice rang clear and strong despite her fear. You may control the sheriff, she declared, but you cannot silence the truth. That mine belongs to Caleb Boone, and no amount of lies will change that. The foreman sneered. Truth? The truth is whatever the territorial judge decides, ma'am. Best start packing before spring comes. The Lord sees your schemes, Eliza replied firmly, and his justice will prevail. Back at the cabin, Joseph sat with Mara by the window as snow began to fall. His little sister's eyes were red from crying. Remember what Miss Eliza taught us about David? Joseph asked, holding her close. How he was brave even when he was afraid. Mara nodded, clutching her slate. She said courage means doing right even when you're scared. That's right, Joseph said. And Mr. Boone is brave like that. He stayed to protect us when he could have run away. As evening shadows lengthened, Eliza gathered the children by the hearth. They knelt together on the rough wooden floor, the firelight dancing across their faces. Dear Father, Eliza prayed, her voice steady, protect Caleb in that cold cell. Give him strength to endure this trial. Show him your love surrounds him even now. Please bring him home, Mara added softly, and help him stay strong. Joseph, whispered Dot in his cell. Caleb watched the last light fade from the winter sky. The preacher's visit had awakened something long dormant in his soul. For the first time in years, he felt the stirring of real faith. Kneeling by his cot, Caleb struggled to form words. Lord, he whispered roughly, I ain't prayed proper in a long time, but I surrender now, not my will, but yours. Tears fell freely as he continued. Thank you for sending me that family. Help me be worthy of them. If there's strength in me, it comes from you. As he prayed, warmth seemed to fill his chest, not the fierce heat of anger he had nursed for so long, but the gentle glow of returning faith. It reminded him of childhood prayers at his mother's knee, of hymns sung in mountain churches, of truth he had tried to forget Dot in that cold cell. Surrounded by iron bars and stone walls, Caleb Boone found himself finally, truly free. The bitterness that had chained his heart for so long began to melt away, replaced by something stronger. The courage that comes from knowing you are loved, not for what you own or earn, but simply because you are a child of God. His whispered prayers joined those of Eliza and the children, rising like incense through the starlit night. Though separated by walls and distance, they were united in faith and love stronger than any earthly bonds. Snow swirled through the bitter morning air as townspeople hurried up the courthouse steps. Inside, the wood-paneled courtroom filled quickly, benches creaking under the weight of settlers, miners, and merchants eager to witness Caleb Boone's hearing. Caleb stood straight back before the territorial judge, his weathered face betraying no fear. Eliza sat in the front row, her spine rigid with determination, while Joseph and Mara huddled close beside her. Greyhawk watched from the back, his dark eyes missing nothing. The syndicate's foreman stepped forward first, producing papers with a flourish. Your Honor, these documents prove Boone's deed is invalid. The mine rightfully belongs to Denver Pacific Interests. The judge adjusted his spectacles, examining the papers carefully. Whispers rustled through the crowd like dry leaves. I call Miss Eliza Harland, the county prosecutor announced. Eliza rose gracefully, her simple dress neat despite weeks of worry. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore her oath clearly. "Miss Harland, what did you witness regarding Mr. Boone's deed filing?" the prosecutor asked. "I saw Caleb Boone present his deed to the county clerk," Eliza testified, her voice steady and sure. "It was properly stamped and recorded. I watched the entire process myself." The syndicate's lawyer rose to challenge her. "And why should we trust the word of a woman harboring half-breed children?" Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge's gavel cracked sharply. "That will be quite enough, sir. Another remark like that, and you'll be held in contempt." A tense silence fell. Then a deep voice spoke from the back of the room. "I won't speak." Heads turned as Greyhawk strode forward, his bearing proud and dignified. The judge nodded, allowing him to approach. "I am uncle to those children," Greyhawk declared. "I came ready to distrust this man Boone, to take my sister's children away." He paused, looking directly at Caleb. "Instead, I found a man who treats them with honor, who defends their home, who teaches my nephew to split wood and my niece to be brave." The courtroom hung on his every word as Greyhawk continued. "The mine is his by right. But more important, he has earned the right to be called family." Murmurs swept through the crowd. The judge leaned forward, studying a new set of documents. "It seems," he announced gravely, "that certain officials have accepted bribes to obstruct justice." He fixed the sheriff with a stern gaze, including law enforcement. The sheriff's face paled as the judge held up proof of payments from the syndicate. "This case is dismissed. Mr. Boone is to be released immediately. Sheriff Duggan, consider yourself under arrest." Cheers erupted through the courtroom. The syndicate's foreman and lawyers slipped away as deputies led the protesting sheriff out in handcuffs. Caleb stood stunned as friends and neighbors surrounded him with handshakes and congratulations. Then Eliza pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around him, propriety forgotten in the joy of the moment. "Thank the Lord," she whispered against his chest. Caleb held her close, his heart too full for words. Joseph and Mara ran to them, their faces shining. Behind them came Greyhawk, who placed a strong hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You are a good man, Caleb Boone," the Apache warrior said simply. "You have made these little ones your own. Now you are my brother also." Tears pricked Caleb's eyes as he clasped Greyhawk's hand. Together they walked out into the snowy street, no longer outcasts but family. The townspeople watched as Caleb led his newfound family toward home. The widow who had taught him to trust again, the children who had opened his heart, and the proud Apache warrior who now called him brother. For the first time since leaving the mountains of his youth, Caleb Boone walked with his head held high, knowing at last who he truly was. The spring thaw crept down from the high country, turning snow to rivulets that sparkled in the strengthening sun. Fresh green buds dotted the aspens as winter's grip finally loosened its hold on the ridge. Inside the Boone mine, Caleb worked with careful precision, testing each vein and cataloging every discovery. The first substantial gold strike came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Caleb emerged from the shaft, his hands dusty but his eyes bright. Instead of rushing to stake additional claims or hiring more miners, he rode straight to town. There, he met with the bank manager and the preacher, establishing two separate trusts. The first would support Eliza's dream of a proper schoolhouse where all children, regardless of background, could learn together. The second created a fund for widows and orphans in need of shelter and support. "Reckon some folks might call me foolish," Caleb explained to the banker, who studied him with surprise. "But I've learned there's different kinds of riches in this world." Working with the territorial office and Greyhawk's guidance, Caleb used another portion of the mine's first profits to secure permanent land rights for local Apache families. Greyhawk's people would have protected grazing lands and hunting grounds, safeguarded by legal documents that could not be broken by future settlers. "You honor your word," Greyhawk told him one evening as they stood watching the sunset paint the ridge in gold. "This is worth more than any metal from the earth." As May approached, the town bustled with preparation for an event that would have seemed impossible months before. On a bright Sunday morning, townspeople gathered near the ridge, their wagons and carriages creating a cheerful procession up the mountain trail. They assembled in a natural amphitheater of rock, where wildflowers had begun to carpet the ground. Eliza stood radiant in a new blue dress, her hair crowned with mountain blooms. Joseph and Mara flanked her proudly, the boy in a crisp new shirt, the girl wearing ribbons in her dark braids. Caleb waited by the preacher, his usually weathered face softened with joy, his rough hands cleaned and his beard trimmed for the occasion. The gathered crowd joined in singing hymns that echoed against the mountain backdrop. Amazing Grace floated on the spring breeze, joined by Mara's clear, sweet voice rising above the rest. Even Greyhawk, standing with quiet dignity among the witnesses, nodded in appreciation of the music's power. When the time came for vows, Caleb's voice rang strong and sure. He promised not only his love and protection to Eliza, but his dedication to a life guided by faith, justice, and mercy. Eliza's eyes shone with tears as she pledged her own vows, speaking of partnership in both family and purpose. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," the preacher declared, his words carrying across the ridge that had once seemed worthless but now stood as a symbol of redemption. The celebration continued into evening, with tables set up outside the cabin that had become a true home. Lanterns cast a warm glow as people shared food and stories. Children played tag between the trees, while adults spoke of plans for the school and the community's future. Inside the cabin, the family gathered for a private supper around the table that had first brought them together. Eliza's smile glowed in the lamplight as she served fresh bread and stew. Joseph told animated stories about helping in the mine, his eyes bright with pride when Caleb praised his work. Mara hummed softly as she passed plates, pausing occasionally to lean against a new father's shoulder. Greyhawk watched it all with quiet satisfaction, his presence completing their circle. Caleb looked around the table, his heart full. The deed that his brothers had meant as mockery had led him not to isolation, but to connection. The mine they had scorned as worthless had yielded not just gold, but the means to help others. Most precious of all, their rejection had driven him to this place where he finally belonged. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, his hand finding Eliza's beneath the table. She squeezed it gently, understanding all that the simple grace contained. Laughter spilled into the night air, mingling with the song of spring peepers and the distant cry of an owl. The mountains stood solid behind them, sheltering their home, while ahead stretched a future bright with promise and purpose. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.